welcome to Pocket Full of Aces, exploring the flow of resources in the ACE Act hosted by Independent Sector. I'm Darren Isom. I'm a partner with the Bridgespan Group in our San Francisco office, and I'm also a member of Independent Sector's Public Policy Committee, and I'm very excited to facilitate today's conversation. Before we begin, I want to respectfully acknowledge that Independent Sector is based in Washington, D.C., the ancestral home of the Nacotchtank, Anacostan, and Piscataway people who are still in the area and are working to reclaim their land and traditional practices. I also want to acknowledge that many of the buildings and places inhabited in D.C. were built with the labor of enslaved people. I love to kick everything off with a little bit of poetry because poetry is good for the soul, even when discussing policy. And I would start with a piece by Angel Kiddo Williams. For growing numbers of us, our sense of survival, our sense of thriving is embedded in a sense of movement and spaciousness, an increasing allowance for more and more difference. You ask, what is love? Love is space. It is developing our own capacity for spaciousness within ourselves to allow others to be as they are. That is love. To come from a place of love is to be an acceptance of what is, even in the face of moving towards something that is more whole, more just, and more spacious for all of us. So this is the third webinar in Independent Sector's series on the ACE Act and philanthropy reform. Before jumping in, let's start with a few logistical notes. Closed captioning is enabled during today's webinar, so it pop up. At any point during the session, feel free to share your thoughts or submit a question in the chat. Please keep your microphones on mute. And finally, I want to let participants know that this event will be recorded and posted to Independent Sector's website. Now, I'd love to kick off things by asking our wonderful panelists to introduce themselves. We'll start with you, Patrick.
Thanks, Darren. Hi, I'm Patrick Rooney. I'm the Glenn Family Chair of Philanthropy and a Professor of Economics and Philanthropic Studies and the Executive Associate Dean for Academic Programs at the IU Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and pleasure to be here.
Great to have you. Christina, you're up next.
Hi, I'm Christina Mcwilson-Thomas. I'm the Director of Government Relations for the American Red Cross. And as this is also a Veterans Week, I just want to say I'm also the wife and mom of a Marine. So thank you to all of those who have served and support those who have served.
Thanks, Christina. Christina is also a proud Bison, as am I, so Howard University, HU, for all the folks out there. Jim, you're next.
Oh, how do I top that? My name is Jim Andreoni. I'm a professor of economics at the University of California, San Diego. I've been here for 15 or 16 years now. Before that, I was a professor at the University of Wisconsin. I've studied philanthropy my whole career, 35 years, and from many different angles. So, and I recently started turning to studying DAFs, which is a little bit challenging because of the data is not too often there, but it's an interesting road. So I look forward to talking about it.
Thanks, Jim. We have enough data to have a conversation, that's for sure. So excited about that and happy to have you here with us today. So I'm going to talk for a little bit and set the table. So today's convening is part of a series of convenings, each framed through a different lens the sector is using to understand the ACE Act and explore philanthropy reform. Today we'll be having a conversation around the flow of resources over the long term, specifically the impact of proposed reforms on charitable donations and the amount of money available for grant making to charities years into the future. Just to recap quickly from the earlier convenings, which focus on the existing problems in philanthropy and the extent proposed reforms, like those included in the ACE Act, address those problems. The first analyzed the ACE Act from a perspective of public trust in philanthropy and whether current philanthropic practices live up to policymakers and the public's expectations of our sector's role in local communities. Some of the tension points elevated and discussed included private foundations not fulfilling the intent of the 5% payout rule, a lack of transparency about funds flowing from both private foundations and donor-advised funds, and the extent that DAFs that fail to pay out on a regular basis jeopardize how the public views philanthropy and nonprofits as a whole, and jeopardizes how DAFs are perceived from an impact perspective. The second session examined the intersection of equity and philanthropy reform and the extent the ACE Act addresses challenges raised. In this session, some of the issues included the extent the structure of charitable giving incentives provided disproportionately benefit and by extension influence to high-income households, the need to accelerate the distribution of funds from philanthropy to meet current inequities from rather than saving resources for the future, really taking advantage of the moment from a payout perspective in the moment that we're in, and how to enable philanthropic resources to flow to more diverse pool of organizations, including those serving and led by people of color and by populated organizations as well. Relevant ACE Act provisions, so in the conversation today, we'll focus on what the potential trade-offs and upsides might be in trying to address some of the problems I noted earlier in the earlier comments and also sessions. Specifically, we're going to discuss how proposed policy changes may impact donor behavior and the total amount of philanthropic dollars available for grant making. Some of the relevant provisions within the ACE Act that inform this discussion today include incentivizing private foundations to distribute funds to close 5% loophole and encourage faster payouts, imposing enforceable timeframe for donor-advised funds payout, 15 years for qualified DAFs and 50 years for unqualified DAFs with community foundation exemptions, and closing loophole allowing folks to avoid private foundation status and regulation by opening DAFs. So quite a few things to pick apart and talk through from the very meaty ACE Act. Just now that we know what the ACE Act is, what's in it at least, let's think about the extent it may impact the money flowing into philanthropy and the amount of resources available for grant making. And to get us started, Patrick, I know that you have some thoughts here and some data that paints a picture for us. I would love to pass it to you and have you walk through what insights the data offers us on how proposed changes in the ACE Act could impact donor behavior and philanthropic assets.
Yeah, thank you, Darren. And first, I do want to say, and Eric, if you could post that first graphic, I do want to say, Jim Andreoni, we have 5 economists here who study philanthropy in our school, and we all agree that if there's a Nobel Prize laureate for the economics of philanthropy and nonprofits, Jim Andreoni is the running leader of the betting pool by orders of magnitude. So we have a very well-known scholar in that regard. This graphic is from the National Philanthropic Trust 2020 DAF report. And I think it's really intriguing to me because what it shows is contributions to DAFs expressed as a percentage of total individual giving from 2011 to 2019. And basically it shows that it grows from 4.8% to 12.7%. So over 2.5 times the share, which, and I want to be the first to acknowledge that, either of those numbers might have some noise in measurement of them, total giving to individuals and total giving to DAFs. As Jim said, this data is difficult because it's not always available and not always available timely and precise manners that we might prefer. But I think that this graphic shows a substantial trend that DAFs are very popular. And I think given TCJA, which made itemization highly unlikely for most households, and one of the ways it becomes more likely for some households is to be able to bundle their giving in 1 year using a DAF and distribute that over the next year or 2 or 3 as they see fit. Foundations are a great option for some, but they're more complex and more costly. And so I think that has contributed to DAF's popularities. And Eric, if you go to the table, I just have a few comparison points. So this is data from the National Philanthropic Trust DAF reports from a couple different years. And most of this data is from 2014 and 2020. So the number of DAFs has grown over 315% in less than a decade, in 5 or 6 years. Whereas the number of foundations has increased by 13%. The assets in DAFs has grown by 127%, the assets in foundations by 54%. So again, you can see that the DAFs are growing in popularity for a variety of reasons, and we can talk about that later. On the payout rates, I'm approximating for the foundations. Most foundations pay out, there's a minimum of 5%, very few pay out more than 5%. So that's very consistent. The DAFs, the payout rate, and I know Jim has written about this, but the payoff rate reported by the National Philanthropic Trust and others is consistently above 20%. And in 2020, it was reported to be almost 24%. One interesting thing is the decline in the average size of the DAF accounts from almost 300,000 to 160,000 plus or minus in this time period. And I think that's in part because the TCJA, more people started utilizing DAFs as a tool to bundle their giving and spread it out over the next year or two or three or four to become a tax itemizer. And so we see that more people who are middle income, upper middle income are utilizing more, and that's pulling down the average, particularly because as Fidelity and Schwab and the other national DAF funds have lowered their entry barrier for doing that. And so I'll just stop there with as that is data for the background. But I think the data show pretty consistently that DAFs were very popular 5 or 10 years ago, and they're becoming even more popular today.
Thanks, Patrick. And I think that gives us a really good kind of foundation for thinking through in many ways, what's the data say about use of DAFs and the amount of money, at least in reserves from a DAF perspective, that's out there. From all of our panelists, I would love to get your view on how the ACE Act impacts the total amount of resources flowing into the sector. And I use the word flowing there, into the sector, and what are the potential impacts for donors, charities, and communities? And Jim, I'll start with you. Kind of what are your thoughts on extent proposals in the ACE Act may impact donor behavior and the amount of resources flowing into philanthropy? You're on mute, Jim.
Right, how's that? Okay, thank you, everybody. I'm sorry for that little hiccup there. So I've been, as I said, studying the charitable sector for the last 35 years. And when I started studying this, the major concern was how effective was the tax deduction in encouraging people to give. And tax deduction now is very secondary to capital gains tax. It motivating people to move to DAFs so they can more easily take advantage of reduction of capital gains tax, giving appreciated assets. That's a totally different focus. When I first started, the gifts of appreciated property were considered too small of an issue to be of interest to us. Now that's the central feature of donations, I'd say, today. Donor advised funds have really supercharged this factor of the last 10 years, really helped people access these gains more easily. So I think that what the ACE Act is going to do, I'm actually very optimistic about how the ACE Act is going to open up more people to donor advised funds and help us get money going through the funds more efficiently. So the way DAFs are funded, I think you all know that aspect of DAFs is that they're an easy way to avoid capital gains tax. It's simply put, if you want to wash capital gains out of your portfolio, you give your appreciated assets to your DAF rather than donating cash. And if you're too busy to distribute it and deal with it to charity, then all these things can be bequeathed to your heirs, and you pull money out of the estate, so you've escaped estate taxes. So there's nothing pushing you right now to do anything with getting the money out of donor advised funds. We also have to keep in mind that I'm going to just skip to this second. Second is that because there's unpredictability to the timing of being faced with realizing a capital gain, the wealthy people who tend to be more high income will find themselves in situations where they need to put assets into DAFs before they can realize the big capital gain in order just for tax purposes. And also they have lower, they might look at the future as facing declining income tax rates or tax rates, either because they're going to get more of their income out of capital gains, or just have lower income in general because they're retired. So they want to give before you retire to get the deductions at the highest price, the lowest price. So there's going to be lots of money saved up in DAFs waiting to be given out more thoughtfully. So I view the ACE Act as a set of simple rules that prevent DAF sponsors from being their own worst enemies. By that I mean, if you look at the criticisms people have towards DAFs right now, they're pretty serious, because we give a ton of money going into DAFs, and it doesn't look like they're too responsive to the social needs that we're having right now. When the pandemic came and we had the essential workers who were not really getting an essential worker's wage, weren't getting any combat pay, which they should have been getting for these things. And we didn't see the great reserves of donor advised funds being liquidated to help these people out. And so we look at people who are there are greater needs in society, but not much greater giving in response to that in this short-term increase in needs. So that I think people become aware of the fact that there's about $1 trillion worth of money sitting idly, and it could be helping people in these times, and it wasn't accessed. And that could create a backlash for donor advised funds. So I think the rules we have in the ACE Act help charities be more public oriented and more civic minded, and will help perhaps save them from some of the claims that they're just more tax avoidance rather than a public service organization.
Got it, Jim. I'm going to jump in there because I want to pass the mic to Christina as well, but definitely hear your points here about how the rules in the ACE Act allow kind of this growing portfolio of funds to be used in a way that's transparent, in a way that gets money out the door, and in many ways allows it to save it from itself, given how much things weren't liquidated to some degree. And so the basic thoughts that are put into that piece and the thinking there to make sure that those funds are used in the way they were intended to do. Christina, I would love to pass the mic to you as you think about, the proposals in the ACE Act. How do you think it would impact donor behavior and the amount of resources flowing?
Well, I mean, I want to first say that I'm thrilled to be on with all the professors, particularly of economics, undergrad degree in economics, but immigrant parents, you can be a lawyer or a doctor. So I had to move on to law school. So maybe I should have been at UCSD and it would have worked out a little bit better for me. What I will say is this, that the American Red Cross has been around obviously 140 years. We're not new to the giving or to the philanthropic sector. But what our focus is on the donor from a different aspect. So I think if we can shift to answer your question, I just want to shift things a little bit. We take a kind of top line, big picture perspective here, right? So while we don't necessarily support the ACE Act, we don't disagree with all aspects of it. We think it goes into some finer points, and our basic concern with it is it comes off a lot more like a penalty to the actual giver. So our president and CEO, Gail McGovern, who is no stranger to the world of finance at all, has talked to us a lot about how we see the donor, right? So whether we're talking about Miss Smith, who's giving us $65 a year, or Miss Eisner, who's giving us $1 million a year, how do we support the donor? And how do we talk about transparency up front? So for us, these conversations happen early on, and where we think some of the issues might lie are in those development. We have a development team as opposed to, let's say, a fundraising team or philanthropic team, however you want to call that. So for our development team, these are conversations that are worked out and discussed early on about what that will look like. How do we talk to the potential donor about our services, about the need for distributions on a regular basis, about how the DAF process would work. We have seen exponential growth. We are very pleased. I should say, in all full disclosure and fairness, that we get a good distribution on an annual basis, and we believe that's because we had these conversations early. And so our concern with the ACE Act, and I just want to put that out there early, is not so much about minimum distributions, but that one, people tend to fall to the lowest common denominator. It's 5%. Okay, well then you said that's the floor. Why should I go for the easy A? I'm going to go for the floor of the C, which is the 5%. Or if we say the 15-year, again, nothing against that, but if we're looking for money to flow to the organization and ultimately from the nonprofit 501c3 aspect, as opposed to, let's say, foundations. I can't speak for community or private foundations, but for us, what we talk about in terms of services is we're looking for the money to flow to the organization so we can continue to provide services. That is the conversation up front. That's the conversation in the middle. That's the conversation at the end. And we believe if that conversation is had, you will get there. Should we look at modifying taxpayer behavior, donor behavior? We just believe that that is not the role of the nonprofit in this aspect. Do I, as Christina Thomas, think that taxes regulate behavior? Oh, absolutely. And it's why I own a house and don't rent, because I didn't want to pay for that extra stove or that pipe work out front. I'm just going to be honest with you. But I do. So I can throw my name on it, right? And I can get a tax break. So I'm not saying that that's not there, but our position is if you're transparent and have that uncomfortable conversation up front, you can mitigate a lot of these issues if the goal is not about changing the tax code, but about actually flowing more money into the sector. Now, clearly there's further conversations on how you address wealth inequity and how you move resources into the nonprofit sector and the philanthropic sector to get resources. But at our size level of a nonprofit, we believe this is not our role to push.
Got it. Christina, this is helpful. I'm going to throw the next question to you, but also want to preface it a little bit. And so I think that there's something to be said about the fact that, you're talking about a fairly sophisticated donor, the ones that are having conversations, and a sophisticated organization that has the resources and the infrastructure to be navigating these conversations and pushing them in a way that makes sense for the organization itself. I think that many would argue that, what's in the ACE Act is meant for those folks who are just falling into the work and the thinking. In some ways, some standard guidelines that almost act as a base level of assumption right around the work, and not necessarily is going to be directed at those folks that have more ambitious philanthropic goals or payout goals as well. And they're not going to be slowed down, if you will, about what's in the ACE Act, because basically, they're just think a little bit more sophisticated about these things. I would love, clearly you can only speak from your seat and your organization and the work that you do, but I would love for you, considering that, just to really think through how the ACE Act will impact the total amount of resources under management for both private foundations and donor-advised funds, and what are the potential impacts for donors, charities, and communities. So that's one question. I'm going to give you a two-parter because I know you got it and you're on it. The second one is a little bit more complicated, and I love this idea that you say that to some degree, this is not necessarily your lane from a restricting or changing conversations. I think there is an absolute interesting opportunity now from position of power play for nonprofits and organizations to be a little bit more straightforward in what they would expect from philanthropy and what best practices looks like from their end. And so I think that, considering that we all have a lane in this work, what would be your perspective on what are the provisions within the ACE Act that make the most sense from your side and think that they should be normalized in that sense?
I'm going to start with the last question first. I'm going to say I think it's excellent that we've had these conversations, and I have followed Professor Madoff, who I know is on for a long time, long before Red Cross, when I was still on Capitol Hill. And so I think these conversations are important because I think they do need to be had. And I will leave the weeds to far greater minds than I on the economic structures and the distribution aspects here. What I would say is, to your original point and flowing to that question, which is this: when you, outside of theory, actually go and ask somebody for money, right? So we have different breakouts of how we seek out development. So not giving away all the Red Cross development team secrets here, right? But we have different levels. So if you, the bulk of our donors, well into the 60 to 70% range, are far below 2,500, or we would say 2,499, right? So that's the base level of donor. And I would think for most nonprofits, that's your bread and butter, is your day to day. We have another sector that then takes us up to about the $50,000 level. And then we get, from that next sector into people who are giving a lot more, and I would say more sophisticated givers, and into the million. And this is still in the individual giving development aspect, I'm not talking about corporations, et cetera. When you meet with someone who has a house manager, a maid, a driver, knows what a donor advised fund is, right? I mean, we have people here on the call asking, what is it? When you have that level of person, oftentimes, one, that initial conversation may be with them, but just the secondary conversation, they bringing in their financial advisor. You're not even having it just with them, right? So you're having a far more sophisticated discussion about financing. So how can I help your organization? How can I also, maintain my assets, maintain my status, et cetera, right? Not hurt myself financially, hurt my family financially, or take a big tax hit. These are conversations that you're having with, Miss Eisner at her table. She is not my initial giver who just writes the check for $65. And I go back to where we were with the universal charitable deduction, which I know will come up later, and this is my example with it. When we hit that cutoff of about $300 for individual taxpayers, $600 per household or couple, and we had that discussion, we did not have that discussion with givers at the $50,000, $1 million. Now, they could have still took that first 300, right, or 600 off. That wouldn't even be something they think about. They're talking about assets. They're talking about grant making. They're associated with Fidelity. They have someone that comes to their home. So I just think that it's nice theoretically or to look at certain aspects, but to assume that the sophisticated giver doesn't understand that there is a tax break associated, or as the professor nicely said, they're looking at capital gains. They're talking to you about SALT. They're talking about what happened in the TCJA. If you don't think that that's a real conversation, then you haven't been doing big donor giving. If we were a smaller organization, would we probably feel differently? Probably. We're blessed to be one of the largest nonprofits in the country. We have 19,600 plus employees, 235 chapters, 50 regions, 6 divisions, 500 plus volunteers, and we're a national society. We've been doing this a long time and cultivating a long time. But I do think, since I am on here with such great folks like Jeffrey Moore and Independent Sector and others, I will say that the nonprofit sector might want to take a better look at how we talk about transparency and equity within the sector, and a little less on how we penalize the donor from this aspect, which is how we see this, that the donor will perceive it, right or wrong, but perception is 9/10 of reality, that the donor will perceive it as we are supporting a penalty on their giving. And we don't want to do that, whether you're the $65 giver or the $65,000 giver or the $1 million giver. That's where we are. And we do think it will have an impact.
Thanks, Christina. And Jim, I would love to throw it to you as well, the question more. And I love, Christina, I love this idea of how things are perceived as a penalty. I think that, folks would argue that in many ways, the goal of the ACE Act is to try to create incentives that stop folks from doing things, but that penalizing creates a narrative that clearly is compelling and people see. But Jim, I would love to get your thoughts on, as you hear from folks around the impact and total amount of resources, really, what are your thoughts of how the ACE Act would impact the amount of resources for both private foundations and donor advised funds, and the impact of that on donors, charities, and communities?
Is that for me or?
That's for you, Jim. I'm going to throw it to Patrick right after, but this one's for you.
So I didn't see the ACE Act as having penalties. You could fail to get some subsidies. if you're a foundation. But I didn't see anything in individual incentives for donors that I would see as a penalty. I think what it encourages is creativity on the parts of donor advised funds to help design fundraising schemes that foster more flow through organizations. So I think we have a different reading of the law in that regard. So yeah, so I don't. I'm happy to hear Christina elaborate more on those points, or if Patrick has something to say on that one.
Got it, Jim. That's helpful. And Patrick, I do want you to jump in as well. I mean, I think that there's a great conversation here about, like, in many ways, how are you thinking about, I think that the ACE Act it's attempt is in really ways to incent or incentivize different types of giving and behavioral change in that sense. Clearly, as you incent some things, you disincent others. And so would love your thoughts here on the comments of the folks on the panel.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. So, first, I think I have a concern that, there are a lot of concerns about DAFs, and I think one of them that's very legitimate is I don't think foundations should be allowed to make a payment or a grant to a DAF and then have that count as part of their 5% payout. That is just kind of recycling dollars. And I think whether that's illegal or not, it certainly does not live up to the letter of the law about the foundation payout rate. Second, I do think that, Professor Andreoni and Professor Madoff and I would all agree that if we were to start out designing DAFs and the rules around DAFs today, they might be different than what they are today, right? However, I think Christina is absolutely right that it is what it is today. And if you take away some of those benefits of DAFs, the donors will see that as a diminishment of their rights as donors or their incentives to give. And so my concern would be that if we make it too onerous for donors to give to or through DAFs, or too embarrassing, too difficult, they may spend that money on themselves, and that would reduce the flow of funds coming into the sector, that they might buy another yacht or another vacation home, and those dollars won't come in. I think also some of the concerns about DAFs are important theoretical concerns, but they're not empirically as much of a concern as they might appear. For example, most of the money does flow through DAFs relatively quickly, much faster than through foundations. Relatively, there's concern about anonymous giving, and yet there's nothing really wrong with anonymous gifts, and very few gifts through DAFs are anonymous, about 20% according to Fidelity. And I think part of the ACE Act proposal was to catch up on the timing between when a donor makes the gift and when they make to a DAF, and when the charity gets the money and when the donor gets the tax deduction. And first, I understand that from a present value perspective, but I think it would make the reality very complicated for most people. And also from a tax perspective, if you have a liquidity moment, you sell a business, you get a big inheritance and so on, you may have a tax consequence today that you can ameliorate through making a gift to a DAF. But if you don't get that tax deduction until the money is actually spent out to charities, then that will cause, that'll dissuade people from making the incentives to make a gift, because it'll just be more complicated. And also, I think the differences in the present value of those future dollars are relatively small. So I've probably gone on too much, but I think DAFs are good. They could be better, but I fear that we may risk losing gifts if we meddle in it too much.
Aaron, can
Thanks,
I say
Patrick, and
something
love.
as well?
Yeah, go ahead, Christina.
I just want to add to what Patrick said in terms of present dollars and what I meant about a penalty. We can live in the nice world I wish I did that was, everything worked out the way it's supposed to, and the letter of the law was adhered to the way it should be. But I'm saying, given current politics and the fact that I'm a federal lobbyist, I'm going to go with no. Sometimes what's written is not, where you go with interpretation. And the simple fact is, a lot of people, right or wrong, intent or not, perceive restrictions on how they give, or increased restrictions on how they give, as a level of a penalty, right? If I don't get the deduction in year one, I have to wait 2, 3, 4. We see that as a penalty. SALT, penalty. Well, I mean, you are where you are. You could move. You're not moving, right? You could be in places where there are better tax benefits. You choose not to, right? People with a lot of money, people who have the ability to park money in a DAF and let it sit and still take distributions. Now, I'm not talking about everyone and not all folks who have a DAF, but if we're talking about a wealthy donor, if you think that they're not going to find another way to park money, you're mistaken. I mean, history, you don't need economics. You can just go take a good history class on this country or Europe or anywhere else and see where we park money. My father's from the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, and if you're interested in where some money is being parked, I suggest you look no further than a little bit south. People know how to get money. The key, I think, that we're not focusing on, and this is based on the ACE Act, and I think that's important, but one of the issues is, what is the goal of nonprofits in being involved in here? Is the goal that you want to see greater money flowing to charities so that you can do more for communities? Then is this truly the vehicle that is going to get us there? Or is this a vehicle for people who know how to move money around to say, that's not where I want to do it. I'll give it this way. I'll give you a smaller check. And the way I tell you that is, when we had people concerned about how the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, or TCJA, would act, we saw a hold in a lot of our big gifts. People wanted to see kind of what the fallout was there, and were they going to see an impact to their money. Now, did people who gave us $5,000 or less do that? No, we didn't see big changes there. But in our high in our development teams that dealt with high and high income earners and wealthy donors, we saw a lot of people hold for longer than normal. And they said, I want to see what shakes out in the law and how this may affect me in my tax. So I will give you something, but I'm going to give you less. And that was an instant impact. We saw that right away. And that's why I don't kind of believe the it won't impact. They do think about it. And it may not be how you and I, because I'm not wealthy, think about it. I work for the nonprofit. Is that this is something that's going through a thought process that's going through a lot of people's heads. And so it may not be that you don't get the gift, but you may get less. And that's something that we're concerned about.
Well, if
Thanks,
people are
Christina. I'm sorry, go ahead, Jim.
If people are putting hold on their contributions because they don't understand yet what's written in the fine print of the law, they might need a few months to things to shake out. I mean, I reacted that the same way. That's not the same as having people responding to punishments in the law. It's just that's them not understanding what the various consequences of the provisions of the acts will be. So I think now things have settled down now from those days, and if we had the data, we could check to see what their behavioral responses were. And we don't have that kind of transparency right now. So just wanted to make that point that really we don't know how people are seeing these changes. I think I do think that if people see things as restricting their behavior, they never like to be told they can't do things they used to be able to do. But I think if you can explain part of the process that if we're treating everybody this way, And the effect of this is we're generating a culture of regular, generous giving. And you know, Red Cross is one of the best charities out there in this regard. They're constantly doing good things around the world. They're staying in public eye, and it would be easy to talk people into staying with the Red Cross. And we explain to them that we need we want to get this ball rolling and getting sort of a more greater flow, which maybe we can still maintain our cash balances to almost the same degree as we did before, but we just get so much more money going through. That's if these restrictions to the 15-year DAF are maybe making it us able to accomplish that, then that could be a welcome change. You can make your donors feel like they're part of an improvement in the world, rather than being held back and punished. Behavioral economics has shown that if you give people deadlines for this kind of decisions, it helps them very much. Doesn't matter whether it's deadlines for giving to a charity or turning in your homework assignments. Putting regular deadlines in gives people cues people to think about, to make plans, to start envisioning themselves giving money away every 3 years, or however we want to structure it. And just knowing that in 15 years I have to have something picked for, will get people thinking right away about what they want to support, and get them to move earlier and commit earlier to some cause. And that's to the greater good of the whole world. And we'll create a more vibrant. And then you'll have statistics on your own donors to say to them, you know, we've got a real movement towards this program we're having that has people giving, you know, so much more money on a more frequent basis, or you know, something that you've done to respond to the deadlines and promote the benefits that they give people. So I think that, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean, because we're spending more money, seeing more money going out the door, doesn't mean we're seeing less money coming in the door. You know, we can the same, you know, we increase both. I think we can use one hand to wash the other here. And we think, you know, we respond to this thoughtfully, which I'm sure the Red Cross will do. We can not be made, we can be better off in every respect.
Thanks, Jim. And I do want to think through that point, that last point you made, that this idea of how do you make it a win-win situation where there's both more money going out the door and more money coming in. I think that's a great point to make. I think there's also a conversation to be had. I'm not worried about wealthy people being able to hold on to money and saving money. I'm sure there are plenty of people that are paid a lot of money to worry about that, and I'm sure there are many paths that people can take to do that. I am worried and thinking about how do we shape the narrative in a way that wealthy people are paying out money in a way that is supportive of the sector and allows a broader segment of the community to benefit from those funds. And as Jim talked about, normalizes this idea of best practices, and how can laws and bills and others such as the ACE Act, how can they be constructed to do that? And I know we were coming close to the end of the call. I do want to, and Jim, this one's going to go straight to you. You know, after we've thought through kind of the technical ins and outs of resource flows and the ACE Act, I'd love to broaden the discussion beyond the narrow lens of this particular webinar and get a sense of this panel's experts' broader view on the ACE Act or other policy proposals we may want to consider to strengthen the sector. So how can we really think about what is needed to strengthen the sector from a philanthropic or financial or otherwise perspective?
Well, the obvious big issue, and I think has not quite gone public yet, still in the close quarters of people who are in this virtual room here, know is that the big unspent balances in DAFs. So it looks like, it's hard to deny that this isn't some sort of a parking lot for money. And maybe there are good reasons for it, but it doesn't look good to the world. So we need to design and think about ways we can get that money out faster. And I think right now, I think charitable organizations or charitable intermediaries like the deaf sponsors that we all know, they're acting more like financial intermediaries than charitable intermediaries. They're helping people save money on their taxes, which is fine, and they're legally entitled to do that. But that's, I think, how they're becoming viewed by the public more and more every day, especially as these funds get bigger and bigger. What they really want to be is charitable intermediaries. I want to find a way to match you with some organizations you care about and give your money in a way that makes you feel really good. And so right now, if you're if you secure a good tax break, that's the win. And the loss would be to fail to get that. You frame it as the win as you get to give more money to charity now. And the loss is that you just sit with money in your otherwise fund. You can reframe the question and take advantage of the loss aversion that people are well known to express in many situations. And usually it's the fact that we have a finite period of 15 years, move people into that kind of DAF, have them set up 3 or 5 year increments or periodic giving cycles, and really push to move things through both in and out until they get that experience of giving, and we'll start to be able to feel like our work is more as a charitable intermediary, matching you with your charity, with your cause. It's going to affect your heart and change your life. And this provides us the excuse that we're doing it because the government's telling us to do it, but let's make the most of it.
Thanks, Jim. And I love this idea of how do we kind of reframe the conversation to really make it a question of charitable giving and really normalize this idea of giving in a greater sense. Patrick, I'm going to pass it to you next, and would love your thoughts really. And this is, where I think that if there's anything we're missing right now, it's this idea of radical imagination. And I joke all the time, generationally, part of my greatest gift as a professional has been navigating broken systems. And I worry that sometimes that excellent gift has allowed me to enable broken systems, right? So you become an enabler of broken systems using your excellent gifts and tools, right? I would love your thoughts on if we were to think about, philanthropy reform proposals, including ASAC going forward. What are some things you think would be really critical for us to be focusing on and thinking through?
Yeah, Darren, thank you. So I think that I think this is a really important question, and I think some of the things that we could do would have a more positive impact on the flows of funds coming into the sector, such as the universal charitable tax deduction, or better yet, a universal charitable tax credit. And we can talk about the details of that. Increasing the capital gains tax rate, so treating it as ordinary income. That would encourage a lot of assets that had accumulated value to be donated to the charitable sector. Similarly, the estate tax is essentially what only applies to like 0.00007% of estates. That needs to be changed. The exemption level is just too high. We're really setting ourselves up for endless generations of wealth holders who will do nothing other than inherit their wealth, and they'll never have to work. So, having a meaningful inheritance tax, having, a wealth tax is complicated, but you could have a wealth tax that would also stimulate philanthropic giving. We also have to understand, as an economist, I get the fact that some of these things, if you start taxing too much on wealth and so on, might have disincentives for savings, investment, and risk taking. So, but you can do these things in a wise manner, and we can do these things to stimulate giving to charity in a way that we have never seen before.
Thanks, Patrick. Christina, I'll pass it to you.
Give us your money. We're doing good things. Jim said it, and it's being recorded. No, I think I just want to go back to that. You know, we're not against everything in the ACE Act, and I want to ping Patrick's point on that in terms of not just the minimum distributions or the yearly part. I think the concept of it is something that many of us support, and that is not the issue. But I go back to roles and priorities, right? Like, with the Red Cross, we can prioritize many things. I'm sorry, am I echoing? See, I should have had the headphone. But in terms of that is we start early with reasons to give. And I want to just go back to that because this is a nonprofit sector hosted call. I give to charity because I'm feeling charitable, period. We want them to give because they're feeling charitable, because there's a lot of us out there, right? They can divvy it up and people can get much less. So when you're talking about large scale gifts that can have massive impacts, like the Mackenzie Scott type gifts, right? That could have gone in a DAF, that could have gone as a check, it could have gone many ways, but what is the way that's going to have the most impact? That was people also cultivating that. Do you have a strong system? Are you transparent? Are you honest? A lot of times what I see is, and this is just frank, and I think, you know, Darren, this goes to your background with a lot of people who are on our development teams, is there's been this old notion that we just want to try to get the money in the door and check the box and say, look, we have money coming. We have promised money. And maybe the conversation, and I'm not saying it solves it all, but a lot of the conversation has not been made on the front end of, is this the right donor for you? Just checking the box and money sitting for trillions, what kind of donor did you have? We're in a situation right now, I'm going to speak to it because it's 2021 and it's November and everybody knows what's out there, is COVID-19. Lots of facts, lots of science, lots of time, and yet some people take it as like, whew, thank goodness, let's do it and save everybody. And some people take it like you're restricting me. And that's what we're going to find in the donor class. Unfortunately for us, some of the most wealthy may be in the class that says, hey, that's the restriction on me. That's a gamble. And you know that because if you have a relationship with a donor, and when you have a wealthy donor, you've had a relationship because you're going to their house. This isn't Miss Smith next door who dropped a check off in the post office. This is somebody you've probably been to their house, to their job, they've been to on site with you. You know who this donor is. And Patrick, you just hit a key point. This is not some broad group. I mean, yes, the millionaire class has grown in this country, but most of us are sharing or have knowledge of, through our development teams, similar groups of folks. And I don't think the conversation has been had on the front end about what we do about that. I'd like us to play a little more active role on things like estate tax and other issues, which I do think create better equity, which are in the nonprofit sector's wheelhouse about being community advocates and supporters of humanitarian needs and growth. That is where I think the Red Cross plays a role, and what we push on are things in that nature and of having conversations up front. I can't tell you what to do with the trillions that are parked currently, but I can tell you for us, what we've made an active push directly from our president and CEO is have transparent and honest conversations up front about what the needs of the nonprofit are, what the needs of our sector is, what our services are, and what we're hoping to expect as we cultivate that large gift, and not go in saying, oh, we just want to help you and however you want to do it, and thanks, and check the box so we can use the assets for later growth on a loan or something else. We don't want to count assets that aren't truly there. And that's what's happening with a lot of these folks. So I encourage us to bring on some of the smaller nonprofits and see how they feel about DAF distribution. Is it having an impact on a small nonprofit? I don't know that it is. And I'd love to see all the data on that.
Thanks, Christina. And we're going to our last 5 minutes and just want to try to wrap things up a bit. One, I would love for us, just the panelists, and I'll start first with you, Patrick, but the question that I have is just thinking back to the conversation we just had, things that'll be lingering on your mind, and also things you want to have folks out in the audience think through. Would love for you to name one or two quick takeaways for us to walk away with today. And I'll start just to give you a second to think through. For me, I think that a big takeaway is Christina's point, sometimes still yours, about thinking about how this impacts all within the sector, particularly those organizations that are new to receiving large funds, or as even being included from an engagement perspective or from a belonging perspective in philanthropic conversations and new topic areas or content areas that people have taken an interest in the past 2 or 3 years around equity. So really thinking about how this conversation impacts them, and what are the ways from a curve cut effect or target universalism can we focus on them as a nonprofit organization to shape policies that get at their needs as a way of helping a more robust sector as a whole. Patrick, what takeaways you got for us?
So just a couple of quick points. So, I think, most of our conversation has been around, major gift donors. And I want to say that, philanthropy, we define philanthropy as voluntary action for the public good. And I think that that does include big donors, and big gifts are good gifts as well. And it's better than another yacht, right? And if a big gift leads to a cure for Alzheimer's or cancer, that everyone would benefit. At the same time, we want to be respectful of small donors, medium-sized donors, donors at all ranks, and volunteers, because they play an important part of our philanthropic sector. And I think one other thing is that in the DAF conversation, the anonymous gifts are viewed with suspicion, and sometimes justly so. On the other hand, in some moral systems, anonymous gifts are viewed as a superior gift because the person is not taking social or public credit for it. And so I think that there are multiple sides to each of these aspects to donors, large and small.
Thanks, Patrick. Jim, can you offer us a point, a takeaway for the room?
Yeah, so when the world changes, that's both a new constraint, but also a new opportunity. And I think that thinking about how we can make the most of changes that promote equity and inclusion to really stimulate more participation and make us feel like we're on the same team again. And that can be a very hopeful outcome from this legislation and the new world it would create.
Thanks, Jim. I love anything that makes us feel like all one squad. And Christina, I'll have you close us out this question.
Well, I'm going to say one, thanks to my other panelists. I'm feel smarter just being on here with you guys. So I appreciate it. I'm going to go have to dust off some of my Keynesian books here. The other that I'll say is, I think if the focus is on equity and on being good philanthropists, we're in the right direction, and we support that. As a member of our team here at the American Red Cross, that's what we want to see: greater equity in the system. Whether they're a large nonprofit like us or have 25 people that work for them, we're all out there trying to do help in the community, and that's really the key. So I want to start with that point. The second on here is to say that, again, our average donor is not the high wealth donor. They are not giving DAFs. They are writing checks. They're coming in. They're also volunteering their time. And so we support gifts, whether they're large or small, and we want to encourage givers, whether they're large or small. 90 cents of every dollar that's given to the American Red Cross goes to our services. We could not always say that. And the reason we can say that now is because we've had the tough conversations, and they're not fun, and they're not easy for somebody who you want to give you money. But if you have it, I think we can address a lot of the forward issues, at least on this particular aspect, going forward, as opposed to what we can do retrospectively. So I just appreciate that we're having a conversation. I think we're going in the right direction as a sector.
Thanks, Christina. And just want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you, panelists. You guys were awesome as expected. I think Allison's posted in the chat a survey. Your actions and insights are critical as we move forward with the work. And I also just want to put in a plug for Independent Sector's fourth and final convening on this topic, ACE in the Whole, bringing together our learnings on the ACE Act, Go Bison for real, and which will be held on December 1st at 2 p.m. And it will report the highlights from previous convenings on trust, equity, and resources, and identify what's missing from the conversation. So hope you guys will join us then. Appreciate your time and talk with everyone again soon. Keep up the good work, everybody.